Elara Crane clutched the worn carpet bag on her lap, its faded roses a stark contrast to the dun-colored landscape blurring past the stagecoach window. Each jolt of the wheels on the rutted track was a reminder of the miles, hundreds of them, that now lay between her and the life she had known, a life of quiet desperation in a bustling city that had no room for a woman of modest means and even more modest prospects. The letter from Mr. Silas Blackwood of Redemption Creek, Montana Territory, had been a lifeline, penned in a surprisingly neat hand, speaking of a need for a wife, a partner to share in the building of a future on the frontier. It promised not riches, but honesty, a home, and companionship. For Elara, who had known little of any of those, it was enough. More than enough. The dust, thick as miller's flour, coated her dark traveling dress and settled in her throat, but she barely noticed, her gaze fixed on the distant, jagged line of mountains that seemed to claw at the vast, indifferent sky. Redemption Creek. Even the name held a certain austere promise, a place where one might begin anew, where past sorrows could be buried deeper than any grave. She smoothed a stray strand of auburn hair that had escaped her severe bonnet, her heart aflutter with a trepidation that was almost indistinguishable from hope. Mr. Blackwood had described himself as a man of simple tastes, hard-working, recently acquiring a small parcel of land. He had not mentioned children, and Elara, while not averse to them, had allowed herself to imagine a quiet life, perhaps two souls finding solace in each other amidst the raw beauty and harsh realities of this new world. The coach lurched to a final, jarring halt. Redemption Creek, the driver grunted, his voice as coarse as the burlap sacks piled on the roof. Elara peered out. It wasn't so much a town as a handful of weathered buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the enormity of the plains. A general store, a saloon with surprisingly intact windows, a blacksmith's forge already ringing with the clamor of hammer on anvil, and a small, steeple-less structure that might have been a church or a meeting hall. There was no welcoming committee, no sign of a man who might be Silas Blackwood. A knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. She paid the driver, her last few coins clinking with a desolate finality, and stepped down onto the dusty thoroughfare, her legs stiff and unsteady. The air was thin and carried the scent of pine from the distant hills, mingled with something less pleasant, neglect, perhaps. She asked the driver, "Might you know where Mr. Silas Blackwood's property lies?" The driver, already untying luggage, merely jerked a thumb westward. "Out past the dry gully, 'bout 2 miles. Can't miss it." Such as it is, his tone was dismissive, almost pitying, and Elara's unease deepened. Clutching her bag, she began to walk, the sun beating down with surprising intensity. The path indicated was little more than a pair of faint-wheel ruts snaking through sagebrush and sparse, hardy grasses. The silence was profound, broken only by the buzz of unseen insects and the mournful cry of a hawk circling overhead. 2 miles felt like 10. And then she saw it. The word farm seemed a grand overstatement for the collection of dilapidated structures that sagged wearily before her. The cabin was small, its log walls chinked with crumbling daub, a stone chimney leaning at a precarious angle. The barn, if it could be called that, was a skeleton of weathered timbers, its roof mostly gone. A broken fence corralled nothing but weeds. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sign of life, save for a gaunt dog that rose from the shade of the porch, regarded her with dull eyes, and then lay down again with a sigh that seemed to echo the desolation of the place. This could not be it. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Mr. Blackwood had written of building, of hope. This was a place where hope had come to die. As she drew closer, a figure emerged from the deeper shadows of the porch. Not Mr. Blackwood, whose likeness she had imagined 1,000 times, sturdy, kind-eyed. This was a woman, older, her face a roadmap of hardship, her dress faded to near invisibility. She wiped her hands on a stained apron, her expression unreadable. "You'll be Miss Crane, I reckon," the woman said, her voice flat. "I'm Martha Halloway. From the next claim over." Such as it is, Elara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Mr. Blackwood." "Silas." He was expecting me. Mrs. Halloway's gaze softened, but only a fraction. He was, she affirmed. "But I'm afraid you've had a long journey for naught, child." "Silas." "Well, Silas took a fever 3 weeks back." Passed on a week ago. The words, delivered with the bluntness of frontier necessity, struck Ilara with physical force. Gone? All her carefully constructed dreams, her modest aspirations, turned to dust, just like the earth beneath her worn boots. The vast, empty landscape suddenly seemed to press in on her, suffocating. Gone, she whispered, the sound swallowed by the immense silence. But the letter. He wrote of plans, and Mrs. Halloway sighed, a weary exhalation of breath. Silas was ever a man for plans. Not always for seeing them through, mind. He was a good man, in his way. Soft-hearted. Too soft, maybe, for this life. As she paused, then added, her voice dropping, he didn't mention, in his letters, did he? About the children. Ilara frowned, confused. Children? He wrote of no children. He said he was alone. A shadow crossed Mrs. Halloway's face. Not his own. No. But they're here. 7 of them. Their folks died on the trail west last fall, cholera. Silas found them, half-starved, up near Split Rock. Couldn't leave them, he said. Brought them here. Been trying to care for them, but she gestured vaguely towards the silent, forbidding cabin. He wasn't well himself, not for a long time. And now her voice trailed off. 7 children. Orphans. Here. In this place of ruin and sorrow, under the care of a man now dead. Ilara felt a cold dread seep into her bones, far colder than the Montana wind that was beginning to stir the dust around her feet. This was not just a journey's disappointing end, it was the beginning of a nightmare she could never have conceived. The hope she had carried for so many miles crumbled, leaving behind an aching void. Mrs. Halloway seemed to sense the abyss opening beneath Ilara. They're inside, she said, her voice low, nodding towards the cabin. Scared as rabbits, and likely twice as wild by now. I've been bringing what little I can spare, but I've my own to feed. She looked at Ilara, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, pity, perhaps, or a grim sort of challenge. Silas, he meant to do right by them. He just ran out of time. The door of the cabin creaked open a few inches, and a pair of eyes, large and dark in a small, dirt-streaked face, peered out before vanishing abruptly as the door slammed shut. The sound echoed the finality of Ilara's own hopes. 7 of them. The number itself felt overwhelming. What was she to do? She had no claim here, no connection to this place or these children, save for a dead man's letter and a broken promise of a life that would never be. The logical thing, the sensible thing, was to turn around, to somehow find her way back to Redemption Creek, to throw herself on the mercy of whom? The gruff stagecoach driver? The taciturn townsfolk she had glimpsed. The thought was as bleak as the landscape. I should see them, Ilara heard herself say, the words emerging as if from a great distance. Her body felt numb, her mind reeling, yet some instinct, deeper than conscious thought, propelled her forward. Mrs. Halloway nodded slowly. Best you do. She led the way onto the porch, which groaned under their combined weight. The interior of the cabin was plunged into a gloomy twilight, the few small windows grimy and curtained with what looked like old feed sacks. The air was heavy, rank with the smells of unwashed bodies, stale food, and despair. As her eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge from the shadows. Children. Huddled together in the furthest corner, like a covey of startled quail. They were a tableau of misery, their clothes ragged and filthy, their faces smudged with grime, their hair matted. But it was their eyes that seized Ilara's heart and squeezed it dry, large, haunted, filled with a primal fear that spoke of losses too profound for their tender years. Mrs. Halloway spoke softly, now, you young uns, this here is Miss Crane. She knew Mr. Blackwood, a girl, perhaps 10 years old, with tangled brown hair and a fiercely protective stance, pushed a smaller child behind her. This must be Martha, Ilara guessed, already bearing burdens too heavy for her narrow shoulders. He ain't here no more, she stated, her voice surprisingly steady, though a tremor ran through it. We know. Beside her, a boy of about 8, his face set in a scowl of defiance that didn't quite mask the terror in his eyes, glared at Ilara. Tom, Ilara imagined, already learning that aggression was a shield. Two smaller boys, clearly twins from their identical, dirt-caked faces and wide, frightened eyes, clung to each other, perhaps Ben and Finn. A little girl, no more than 5, with enormous, solemn eyes, hid behind Martha's skirt, a thumb plugged firmly in her mouth. Lily. Another girl, a little older than Lily, with watchful, intelligent eyes, assessed Ilara silently from the edge of the group. Sarah. And finally, a boy, perhaps 7, who tried to stand tall but whose trembling lip betrayed him. David. 7 souls, adrift and alone. Ilara's own disappointment, her own weariness, seemed to recede in the face of their palpable suffering. They were so small, so terribly vulnerable. What would become of them if she simply walked away? The authorities in Redemption Creek, if such organized help even existed in this fledgling settlement, would likely see them as a burden, to be shipped off to some distant, impersonal institution if they weren't simply scattered to the winds. The thought was unbearable. I am sorry about Mr. Blackwood, Ilara said, her voice hoarse. He wrote to me. I came to be his wife, a flicker of something, surprise? Disappointment? Crossed Martha's face. Tom just scowled harder. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Mrs. Halloway shifted her weight. Well, I best be getting back. Sun be setting soon. She looked at Ilara, then at the children. There's a bit of jerky and some cold corn bread on the table yonder. Not much, but her gaze lingered on Ilara. You need anything, you send one of the older ones. It's a fair walk with that. She was gone, the closing door leaving Ilara alone with the 7 silent, staring children and the crushing weight of an impossible situation. She stood there for a long moment, her carpet bag still clutched in her hand, the faded roses a mockery of any gentler life. Her mind raced. She could leave. She could walk back to town, insist that someone take responsibility. It was not her burden. She had come seeking a husband, a home, not a ready-made family of 7 traumatized orphans in a derelict cabin on the edge of nowhere. The injustice of it, the sheer, cruel twist of fate, welled up in her. And yet, as she looked at their pinched faces, the hollows under their eyes, the way Lily's small hand clutched Martha's skirt as if it were the only anchor in a storm-tossed sea, something within her shifted. It wasn't a grand epiphany, no sudden surge of maternal love. It was something quieter, deeper, a desolate recognition of shared humanity, of profound vulnerability. She, too, was alone, in a strange and unforgiving land. Her hopes had been shattered, her future was a terrifying blank. But she was an adult. She had agency, however limited. These children had nothing, no one. The cabin was cold, despite the afternoon sun. A draft snaked in from under the ill-fitting door. Ilara shivered, though not entirely from the chill. The smell of hunger was a palpable thing in the small room. She thought of the few provisions Mrs. Halloway had mentioned. It wouldn't be enough. Nothing here was enough. Despair was a seductive whisper, urging her to flee, to save herself. But then she met the gaze of Sarah, the quiet, watchful one, and saw not accusation, but a flicker of desperate, hesitant appeal. It was a look that asked for nothing and everything all at once. Ilara took a slow, shaky breath. The decision, when it began to form, was not born of courage, but of a profound inability to inflict further abandonment upon these already shattered lives. It was the choice of a drowning person reaching for another, not knowing if they would pull each other up or drag both down. Ilara set her carpet bag down on the dusty floor with a soft thud. The sound seemed to break a spell. The children flinched, but their eyes remained fixed on her. The air in the cabin was thick with unspoken fears, with the ghosts of hunger and loss. Her own future, so abruptly and cruelly rewritten, stretched before her, a bleak and terrifying unknown. Yet, in that moment, looking at those 7 small, frightened faces, her own predicament seemed to recede, overshadowed by their more immediate and desperate plight. She could not, in good conscience, add her abandonment to the burdens they already carried. The thought of walking out that door, leaving them to the mercy of a harsh world that had already dealt them so many blows, settled in her stomach like a stone. My name is Elara Crane, she said, her voice softer now, stripped of the formalities she might have used with Mr. Blackwood. I know this is a shock. It is for me, too. She looked around the squalid room, at the meager, dirty bedding piled in one corner, the rough-hewn table with its pathetic offering of food, the pervading sense of neglect. This was no place for children. It was barely a place for animals. A wave of anger surged through her, anger at Silas Blackwood, for his foolish optimism, for his secrets, for dying and leaving this mess. Anger at a world that could be so cruel to the innocent. But anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. Action was what was needed. Are you hungry? She asked, the question almost absurd in its obviousness. Lily's thumb slipped from her mouth, her eyes wide. Even Tom's hostile mask wavered for a fraction of a second. Martha, ever the little mother, nodded curtly. We ate what Mrs. Halloway brought this morning. Her voice implied it had been very little. Elara walked over to the table. The jerky was tough and sparse, the cornbread dry and crumbly. It was barely enough for one, let alone 8. Her own stomach rumbled in protest, but she ignored it. She looked back at the children. This isn't much, she said, her gaze sweeping over them, trying to convey a reassurance she didn't feel. But we'll share it. And then we'll see what else can be done. She took a deep breath, the decision solidifying within her, heavy and irrevocable. I'll stay. For now. I'll stay and help you. The words hung in the air. She hadn't meant to say them so definitively, but there they were. A promise. A commitment. To what, she didn't fully know. Martha stared at her, suspicion warring with a desperate hope in her young eyes. Why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. You don't know us. Elara met her gaze. No, I don't, she admitted. And you don't know me. But Mr. Blackwood, he asked me to come here to build a life. Perhaps this is part of it, in a way I didn't expect. It was a weak explanation, even to her own ears, but it was the only one she had. The truth was far more complex, a tangle of compassion, desperation, and a stubborn refusal to be utterly defeated. She began to divide the meager food, her hand surprisingly steady. She gave the largest portions to the children, taking only a sliver for herself. They ate in silence, wolfing down the food with a desperate haste that spoke of chronic hunger. Elara watched them, her heart aching. When they had finished, a new kind of silence descended, less fearful perhaps, but still wary. Elara knew that trust, if it ever came, would be a slow and arduous process. Right, she said, trying to inject a note of brisk practicality into her tone. This place needs cleaning. And so do all of you. She looked at their grimy faces and ragged clothes. Is there water? A well. Martha pointed towards the back of the cabin. There's a well. And a creek not too far. But the bucket rope's frayed. Of course it was. Everything here was broken, frayed, or exhausted. Then we'll fix it, Elara said, a strange sense of purpose beginning to stir within her. This was not the life she had envisioned, not the partnership she had craved. But it was a task. A monumental, overwhelming task, but a task nonetheless. And for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she felt a flicker, not of hope, but of grim determination. She would not be broken by this. She would not let these children be broken either, if she could help it. She opened her carpet bag, the contents suddenly seeming frivolous, a lace collar, a book of pressed flowers, a small silver locket from her mother. Useless fripperies in this new, harsh reality. But tucked beneath them were more practical items, needles and thread, a bar of soap, a sturdy comb. Small tools, perhaps, for a monumental undertaking. First, she announced, pulling out the soap, we'll tackle the dirt. Then, we'll tackle this cabin. She looked at Martha. Will you help me heat some water? If there's wood for the stove. Martha hesitated, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a start. A fragile, tentative beginning in the ruins of one man's failed dream and a woman's shattered hopes. Elara knew the road ahead would be incredibly difficult. She had no resources, no allies, and 7 deeply wounded children who might never accept her. But as she rolled up her sleeves, a verse her grandmother used to recite came to mind: do the next thing and the next thing, it was clear, was to bring some small measure of order and cleanliness to this desperate chaos. It was a choice made in the crucible of despair, a fragile assertion of will against the overwhelming tide of misfortune. She would stay. For them. And perhaps, in doing so, she would find a way to save a part of herself as well. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beauty that seemed almost cruel in its indifference to the human drama unfolding below. But as Elara looked at the children, now watching her with a mixture of fear and nascent curiosity, she felt not the despair of an ending, but the terrifying, exhilarating uncertainty of a new, utterly unforeseen beginning. The days that followed blurred into a grueling routine of relentless work, fueled by a desperation that Elara was slowly, painstakingly trying to transform into resilience. The cabin, Silas Blackwood's final, squalid legacy, was her first battleground. With Martha's hesitant help, and eventually, the grudging assistance of Tom, who seemed to prefer any activity to simply watching Elara, they scrubbed floors black with grime, patched holes in the walls with mud and grass, and aired out bedding that reeked of sickness and neglect. Elara, using precious fabric from her own dwindling supplies, fashioned new curtains for the windows, a small act of defiance against the pervasive gloom. The children, initially as skittish as wild colts, began to thaw, albeit with agonizing slowness. Lily, the silent thumbsucker, was the first to show a crack in her defenses. Elara, while mending a rip in the child's tattered dress, began to hum an old lullaby, a melody her own mother had sung. Lily's enormous eyes fixed on her, and for a moment, the thumb slipped from her mouth. She didn't speak, not yet, but a connection, fragile as a spider's thread, had been spun. Tom remained the most resistant. He watched Elara with narrowed, suspicious eyes, his youthful face hardened into a mask of distrust. He challenged her at every turn, not with outright disobedience, but with a sullen reluctance, a silent questioning of her motives. "Why are you doing this?" he finally burst out one afternoon, as Elara was attempting to teach Ben and Finn their letters, using a charred stick on a piece of smoothed plank. "You ain't our ma. You ain't nobody to us." The words were meant to wound, and they did, but Elara kept her voice even. "No, Tom, I'm not your ma," she said, meeting his glare. "And Mr. Blackwood wasn't your pa. But he cared enough to bring you here, to try and give you shelter. I'm just trying to finish what he started. In a way, he left us," Tom muttered, kicking at a loose floorboard. "He got sick and died." That's leaving Elara's heart ached for the raw pain beneath his anger. "Sometimes," she said softly, "things happen that people can't control, Tom. Awful things. It doesn't mean they wanted to leave." She didn't know if her words reached him, but she continued to treat him with the same steady patience she offered the others, mending his torn trousers, ensuring he got his share of their meager meals, never rising to his provocations. Building trust was like coaxing a fire from damp wood. It required constant tending, gentle breaths, and an unwavering belief that a spark, however small, could eventually catch. Food was a constant, gnawing anxiety. Silas Blackwood had left behind a nearly empty larder. The small patch of withered vegetables behind the cabin was beyond saving. Elara bartered a silver brooch, one of her few remaining valuables, with Mrs. Halloway for a sack of flour and some dried beans. She learned to set snares for rabbits, a skill she hadn't known she possessed, her stomach churning the first time she had to skin and clean one, but the sight of the children's hungry faces steeled her resolve. Then, illness struck. Little Lily, always the most fragile, developed a hacking cough that quickly worsened into a burning fever. For 3 terrifying days and nights, Elara nursed her, bathing her hot forehead with cool water, coaxing sips of willow bark tea between her parched lips, and praying with a fervor she hadn't felt in years. The other children watched, their fear a palpable presence in the small cabin. Martha proved a staunch ally, fetching water and keeping the younger ones quiet. Even Tom seemed subdued, his usual defiance replaced by a worried frown. During one long, dark night, as Lily tossed and moaned, her breath shallow, Elara felt a despair so profound it threatened to engulf her. What if she failed? What if, despite all her efforts, she lost this child? The thought was a cold fist clutching her heart. But as dawn broke, grey and uncertain, Lily's fever finally broke. Her breathing eased, and she fell into a deep, healing sleep, her small hand clutching Ilara's finger. The relief that washed over Ilara was so intense it left her weak-kneed. Looking at the sleeping child, her face pale but peaceful, Ilara knew, with absolute certainty, that she was bound to these children, not by law or blood, but by a bond forged in shared hardship and a dawning, fierce protectiveness. The crisis seemed to mark a turning point. The children, having witnessed her unwavering devotion to Lily, began to open up more. Ben and Finn started to chatter, their identical faces beaming when Ilara praised their attempts at drawing letters. Sarah, the quiet observer, began to follow Ilara around, offering to help with small tasks, her intelligent eyes missing nothing. Even Tom's hostility lessened, replaced by a grudging, almost reluctant, respect. He started mending the fence without being asked, his movements betraying a surprising competence. One evening, as Ilara sat mending by the light of a precious tallow candle, Lily, now recovered though still pale, climbed into her lap, a rare occurrence. She leaned her head against Ilara's chest and, in a tiny, hesitant voice, whispered, "Sing." Ilara's heart swelled. She began to hum the lullaby, her voice a little shaky, and soon, one by one, the other children gathered around, their faces softened in the flickering light. In that moment, the dilapidated cabin, with its patched walls and meager furnishings, felt less like a prison and more like a haven. The bridge of trust was still under construction, its foundations perhaps not yet fully secure, but the first tentative planks had been laid, strong enough, perhaps, to bear the weight of their fragile, burgeoning family. Ilara knew their struggles were far from over, but for the first time, a genuine, albeit weary, hope began to bloom in her heart. These children, thrust upon her by a cruel twist of fate, were becoming hers, not in name, but in a way that mattered far more. Hey folks, if Ilara's journey is touching your heart, and you're wondering how this incredible story of resilience unfolds, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done in Ilara's shoes? Alright, back to Redemption Creek and the challenges that still lie ahead for our unlikely family. The fragile peace Ilara had managed to cultivate within the walls of the cabin was inevitably challenged by the outside world. Redemption Creek, though small and remote, was not immune to the judgments and legalisms of society. Word had undoubtedly spread about the strange woman who had arrived to marry the deceased Silas Blackwood and had instead taken up residence with his collection of orphans. Whispers, Ilara knew, could be as damaging as any frontier storm. The first official intrusion came in the form of Mr. Josiah Grice, the town's self-appointed custodian of public morals and, more concretely, the closest thing Redemption Creek had to a county administrator, though his actual authority was nebulous. He arrived one blustery morning on a horse that looked as sour-tempered as its rider, a portly man with small, assessing eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently pursed in disapproval. He surveyed the modest improvements Ilara had made, the neatly swept yard, the patched roof from which a thin plume of smoke now curled, the surprisingly clean faces of Ben and Finn who were attempting to fly a kite fashioned from scraps of paper and twigs, with an air of profound skepticism. "Miss Crane," he announced, not bothering to dismount, his voice carrying an unwelcome authority. "I've come about these children." Ilara, who had been showing Martha how to knead dough for a batch of desperately needed bread, wiped her floury hands on her apron and stepped forward, her heart sinking. She had dreaded this moment. "Mr. Grice," she acknowledged, keeping her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. The children, sensing a threat, had gathered behind her, their earlier playfulness evaporating. "What can I do for you?" "It has been brought to my attention," Grice continued, his gaze sweeping over the children with ill-concealed distaste, "that these dependents of the late Mr. Blackwood are residing here with you. An unmarried woman. It is, to put it mildly, an irregular situation. Irregular it may be, Mr. Grice," Ilara countered, a spark of defiance igniting within her. "But they are children without kin, without shelter. Mr. Blackwood took them in. I am merely continuing his charity." "Charity is one thing, Miss Crane," Grice sniffed. "Competence and propriety are another. There are concerns about your ability to provide for them. 7 mouths are a great many to feed. And there are facilities for such unfortunates. The county orphanage in Helena, for instance." Helena. miles and miles away. The word orphanage conjured images of grim, overcrowded institutions, places where children were lost, their spirits crushed. Ilara felt a cold dread. She looked at Martha's pale face, at Tom's renewed scowl, at Lily who had buried her face in Ilara's skirt. She would not let that happen. "These children have a home here, Mr. Gryce," she said, her voice gaining strength. "They are clean, they are fed, as well as can be managed, given the circumstances Mr. Blackwood left. They are learning. They are cared for by what right, Miss Crane?" Gryce challenged, his eyes narrowing. "You have no legal standing. This property, such as it is, was Blackwood's. His estate is unsettled. These children are, technically, wards of the territory." Ilara felt a surge of panic. He was right, of course, from a purely legal standpoint. She had no claim, no official status. But she had something more potent, a fierce, protective love that had taken root and blossomed in this unlikely soil. "And what would you have me do, Mr. Gryce?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts at control. "Turn them out? Send them to a place where they will be names on a ledger, lost in a crowd of other unfortunate souls? They have already suffered so much loss." Just then, a voice, dry but not unkind, interjected. "Now, Josiah, hold your horses a minute." Sheriff Brody, a lanky, weathered man whose badge was the only shiny thing about him, had ridden up unnoticed. He dismounted, his movement slow and deliberate, and looped his reins over the rickety fence post. He nodded to Ilara, then turned to Gryce. "These young uns seem to be doing a sight better than when Silas was trying to manage on his own." Sick as he was, Gryce puffed himself up. "Sheriff, this is a matter of propriety, of territorial law. It's a matter of 7 children who need looking after, Josiah," Brody said mildly, though his eyes, when they rested on Gryce, were cool. "And Miss Crane here seems to be doing a commendable job, all things considered. Townfolk are saying she's worked miracles out here." Ilara hadn't realized anyone in town had noticed, or cared. A small warmth spread through her. "Miracles or not," Gryce huffed, clearly irked by the sheriff's intervention, "the situation is untenable long term. I will be making inquiries with the circuit judge when he next passes through. These children need proper placement." He gave Ilara a look that promised further trouble, then wheeled his horse around and rode off, his back stiff with indignation. A heavy silence descended. Ilara felt shaken, but also a surge of gratitude towards Sheriff Brody. He had bought them time, at least. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice heartfelt. Brody shrugged, his gaze softening as he looked at the children still huddled near her. "Just stating facts." Silas, he had a good heart, but he was overwhelmed. "You seem to have a knack for it." He paused, then added, "Gryce can be a meddling fool, but he ain't entirely wrong about the legalities. You might want to think on that." Having some kind of standing would help. His words lingered in the air long after he, too, had ridden away. Legal standing. How could she obtain that? She was a stranger here, a woman alone. But the threat of the orphanage, of having her small, hard-won family torn apart, spurred a new resolve. She would fight for them. She had to. That evening, as she tucked the children into their beds, now cleaner and more comfortable than before, she felt their small hands cling to hers, their sleepy murmurs of "good night, Ilara." It wasn't "good night, Mama," not yet, perhaps never. But it was enough. It was everything. The outside world, with its rules and its judgments, had issued a challenge. Ilara Crane, the mail-order bride who had found not a husband but a desperate, unexpected calling, was ready to meet it. The shadow of Mr. Gryce's threat spurred Ilara to new heights of industry, not merely for survival, but to build a tangible defense against a world that might seek to dismantle her fragile family. She knew that demonstrating stability and providing for the children were her strongest arguments. Every small victory became a testament to her commitment, every shared chore a strengthening of their communal bond. The garden, once a patch of withered despair, became her prime focus. With the older children's help, they cleared the tenacious weeds, turned the soil, and, using seeds procured from Mrs. Halloway in exchange for mending, planted rows of hardy vegetables, beans, squash, potatoes, and corn. It was back-breaking work under the relentless Montana sun, but as the first green shoots tentatively pushed through the earth, a collective sigh of hope seemed to ripple through their little group. Tom, surprisingly, took to the gardening with a fierce dedication, his earlier sullenness replaced by a quiet concentration as he learned to distinguish weeds from seedlings, his hands, usually clenched in frustration, now gentle as he coaxed life from the soil. Martha, ever practical, organized the watering and pest control, her brow furrowed in serious contemplation. Even the younger ones contributed, tasked with carrying small buckets of water or gleefully chasing away crows. These shared efforts, aimed at a common goal, wove them together in ways quiet conversation never could. They were a team, united against the threat of hunger. Ilara, drawing on memories of her grandmother's thrift, became a master of making much from little. Flour sacks were transformed into patched shirts and sturdy aprons. Wild berries, painstakingly gathered by Sarah and the twins, were boiled down into precious jam. When Sheriff Brody, in a moment of gruff kindness, gifted them an old, somewhat lame hen, it was treated like royalty, its occasional eggs a cause for celebration. The children, once wary and withdrawn, were slowly blossoming. Lily, no longer a silent shadow, chattered incessantly, her laughter, when it came, as bright and unexpected as a wildflower in a barren field. Ben and Finn, inseparable as ever, invented elaborate games in the nearby woods, their shouts echoing with a newfound joy. David, who had once hidden his fear behind a trembling bravado, now sought Ilara out for stories, his eyes wide with wonder as she recounted tales from her own childhood or invented adventures of brave knights and clever princesses. The cabin itself began to feel more like a home. Ilara encouraged the children to personalize their small sleeping spaces. Martha tacked up a crudely drawn picture of a flower. Tom carved a small, surprisingly detailed wooden bird. These small tokens, these assertions of self, were signs of healing, of roots beginning to take hold in this once barren ground. One evening, as a cool breeze drifted through the open cabin door, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, Ilara found herself humming as she stirred a pot of stew, thin, yes, but fragrant with wild onions and a precious bit of rabbit. She looked around at the children gathered at the rough-hewn table, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the fire. Martha was helping Lily spell out words in a worn primer Ilara had found in her bag. Tom was showing Ben and Finn how to whittle a piece of wood into a whistle. Sarah was quietly sketching in a notebook fashioned from scraps of paper. A profound sense of peace, something Ilara hadn't thought possible just months before, settled over her. This was family. Not the one she had imagined, not the one defined by blood or societal norms, but a family nonetheless, forged in the crucible of shared hardship and cemented by a love that was as fierce as it was unexpected. Of course, challenges remained. Resources were always scarce. The coming winter loomed large in Ilara's mind, a source of constant, low-grade anxiety. Mr. Gryce's threat had not disappeared, merely receded into the background, a reminder that their security was fragile. But the bonds between them were no longer so tenuous. They had faced adversity together and had not broken. One afternoon, while clearing out a neglected corner of a dilapidated barn, Tom unearthed a small, dust-covered wooden box. Inside, nestled amongst some yellowed receipts and a tarnished medal, was a photograph. A daguerreotype, faded and scratched, of a man and a woman, their faces solemn, their hands clasped. Behind them, blurred but discernible, stood 7 small children. It's Mama and Papa," Martha whispered, her voice choked with emotion, as she peered over Tom's shoulder. The other children gathered around, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and wonder. It was the first time Ilara had seen any likeness of their parents, the first tangible link to the life they had lost. Ilara watched them, her heart aching with a sympathy so profound it felt like a physical blow. She saw their grief, fresh and raw, but also a flicker of something else, a shared memory, a connection to a past that, until now, had been almost too painful to touch. Gently, she suggested they find a special place for the photograph in the cabin. Together, they cleared a small space on the mantelpiece, and Tom, with surprising reverence, propped the image there. It was a small shrine, a quiet acknowledgement of the love that had brought these children into the world, a love that now, in a different form, was trying to sustain them. That evening, as they sat down to their meager supper, there was a different quality to their interactions, a subtle shift. The photograph seemed to watch over them, a silent reminder of all they had lost, but also, perhaps, of all they still had in each other. Ilara realized that these small victories, a thriving garden, a mended shirt, a shared memory, a child's hesitant laughter, were the very fabric of their lives now. They were the bricks with which she was building not just a defense against the outside world, but a sanctuary, a place where 7 orphaned souls, and 1 unexpectedly maternal mail-order bride, could finally begin to heal. The love that bound them was quiet, undemonstrative, born of necessity and nurtured by shared experience, but it was as real and as strong as any blood tie. Just as a fragile sense of stability began to settle over Ilara and her unconventional family, a new shadow fell across their hard-won peace, a threat not from officious bureaucracy, but from the lingering tendrils of Silas Blackwood's ill-managed affairs. His name was Jedediah Stone, a man whose reputation in Redemption Creek was as sour as spoiled milk. He was a moneylender, a speculator, a man who always seemed to profit from the misfortunes of others. Ilara had heard whispers of him in town when she bartered for supplies, a name spoken in hushed tones, often accompanied by a shake of the head or a grimace. She had hoped his dealings, whatever they were, had died with Silas. She was wrong. Stone arrived on a day when the autumn winds were beginning to bite, stripping the last leaves from the cottonwoods along the creek. He was a tall, gaunt man, dressed in black broadcloth that seemed out of place in the rustic setting, his face dominated by cold, calculating eyes and a thin, cruel mouth. He didn't bother with pleasantries, his gaze sweeping over the modest homestead with an air of proprietorial disdain. "Miss Crane, I presume," he said, his voice as dry as the dust kicked up by his horse. "I am Jedediah Stone. I have business concerning this property." Ilara, who had been helping the children bank earth around the foundation of the cabin for insulation against the coming winter, felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in her chest. She straightened, wiping her soiled hands on her apron, motioning for the children, who had frozen at the sight of the stranger, to stay behind her. "Mr. Stone," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "What business might that be?" "Silas Blackwood owed me a considerable sum," Stone stated flatly, producing a sheaf of papers from an inside pocket. Secured against this land, and all its appurtenances, he waved a dismissive hand that encompassed the cabin, the barn, and by implication, its current occupants. "With his unfortunate demise, the debt is now due. And I am here to collect." Ilara's blood ran cold. "Debt?" Silas had never mentioned any significant debts in his letters. He had spoken of acquiring the land, of building. But perhaps, she thought with a sinking heart, his optimism had always outstripped his reality. I was unaware of any such debt, Mr. Stone," she said, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "Mr. Blackwood never mentioned it." Stone smirked, a reptilian flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Men like Blackwood rarely advertise their financial indiscretions, madam. Especially not to prospective partners." He tapped the papers. "But the documents are all in order. The land is forfeit. I intend to take possession." "Take possession?" Ilara echoed, aghast. "But the children, this is their home." Tom, ever impulsive, stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You can't just throw us out," he exclaimed, his voice high with outrage. Stone barely spared him a glance. "The law is the law, boy. Sentiment has no place in business." He turned back to Ilara. "I am prepared to be reasonable. You have 1 week to vacate the premises. After that, I will have the sheriff evict you. 1 week. The words were a death knell to the fragile security they had built. Where would they go? What would they do? The thought of the children, homeless again, exposed to the harshness of a Montana winter with nowhere to turn, was more terrifying than any personal threat. There must be some mistake, Ilara insisted, her mind racing. Perhaps Mr. Blackwood had already made arrangements to pay, or perhaps the debt isn't as large as you claim. "There is no mistake, Miss Crane," Stone said, his voice hardening. "The sum is substantial. Far more than this pitiful scrap of land is worth, frankly." But Blackwood was desperate. "And I," he added with a chilling lack of emotion, "was his only option." He thrust the papers towards her. You may peruse these at your leisure. They will tell you the same story. 1 week with that, he wheeled his horse and rode away, leaving behind a stunned silence and a palpable wave of despair. Ilara's hands trembled as she took the proffered documents. They were filled with legal jargon she barely understood, but the figures, the dates, and Silas Blackwood's desperate, looping signature at the bottom of a promissory note told a grimly clear story. He had indeed mortgaged everything, likely to fund his ill-fated attempts to provide for the orphans he had taken in. His soft heart, as Mrs. Halloway had said, had perhaps been his undoing. The children gathered around her, their faces etched with fear. "What does it mean, Ilara?" Martha asked, her voice small. "Is he going to make us leave?" Ilara looked at their anxious faces, at the home they had painstakingly created together from the ruins of Silas's neglect. She thought of the garden, now dormant but promising a harvest next year, of the patched walls that kept out the wind, of the warmth of their small bodies huddled together at night. She couldn't let this happen. She wouldn't. "He wants us to leave," Ilara said, her voice low but firm. "But we are not going to make it easy for him. There must be something we can do, but what?" She had no money to pay off such a debt. She had no legal claim to the land herself. The law, as Stone had so coldly stated, was likely on his side. Desperation threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed it back, focusing on the children's terrified eyes. She had to be strong for them. "We will face this together," she said, trying to infuse her words with a confidence she didn't feel. "We need to think. There might be something in Mr. Blackwood's papers, something Mr. Stone doesn't know about. Or perhaps Sheriff Brody can help." That night, sleep eluded her. She sat by the dying embers of the fire, poring over the few remaining papers Silas Blackwood had left behind, old letters, receipts for tools, a faded map of the claim. There was nothing to counter Stone's claim, nothing to offer a sliver of hope. The week stretched before her like a barren, frozen wasteland. The shadow of Jedediah Stone loomed larger and darker than any they had faced before, threatening to extinguish the small flame of hope and home they had so carefully nurtured. The news of Jedediah Stone's claim and his ultimatum spread through Redemption Creek with the speed of a prairie fire. Ilara, her heart heavy with a grim foreboding, had ridden into town the next morning, the ominous papers clutched in her hand, determined to seek out Sheriff Brody. She found him at the small, clapboard building that served as both his office and meager living quarters. He listened patiently as Ilara recounted Stone's visit, his weathered face growing increasingly grim as she laid out the damning documents on his cluttered desk. "Stone's a vulture, all right," Brody said, shaking his head after examining the papers. "And this here mortgage looks legal as they come, unfortunately." Silas was in a tight spot, and Stone knew it. "He's been circling this claim for a while. I reckon." Ilara's hopes, already flickering, dimmed further. "So there's nothing to be done? He can just take it? Put those children out with winter coming on." The sheriff ran a hand through his thinning hair. "The law being what it is, Miss Crane, my hands are mostly tied if his paperwork's in order. Eviction is an ugly business, but if he gets a court order, I'll have to enforce it." He saw the despair in her eyes and his expression softened. "But that ain't to say we roll over. Stone ain't popular. Folks around here know his kind. Let me ask around a bit. See if Silas mentioned anything to anyone, any other arrangements." Ilara left the sheriff's office with a sliver more hope than she'd entered with, though it felt as fragile as spun glass. As she walked towards the general store to spend her last few coins on essential supplies, she noticed people looking at her differently. There was less of the guarded curiosity she had initially encountered, and more open sympathy, even a nascent anger in some of their expressions. Mrs. Henderson, the proprietor of the general store, a woman whose initial demeanor had been brisk and businesslike, greeted her with an uncharacteristic warmth. "Heard about Stone, Miss Crane," she said, her voice low as she measured out a small bag of beans. "It's a shameful thing, what he's trying to do to you and those young uns." Ilara was taken aback. You know. "Small town, Miss Crane," Mrs. Henderson said with a wry smile. "News travels. And most folks here had a soft spot for Silas, even if he was a bit hapless. And they've seen what you've done for those children. Turning that wreck of a place into a proper home. As Ilara was about to leave, Mrs. Henderson pressed a small sack into her hand. Some extra flour, on the house. And a bit of salt pork. Children need their strength for tears. Pricked Ilara's eyes. I don't know what to say, Mrs. Henderson. Thank you, no thanks needed, the storekeeper said gruffly, though her eyes were kind. Just don't let that weasel Stone win without a fight. The sentiment, it turned out, was shared by more than just Mrs. Henderson. Later that day, as Ilara was preparing their meager supper, a wagon rumbled up to the cabin. It was Mr. Abernathy, the blacksmith, a man of few words but immense strength, his face perpetually smudged with soot. With him were two other townsmen Ilara vaguely recognized. Miss Crane, Abernathy rumbled, heard you might be having some trouble with that varmint Stone. He gestured to the back of his wagon, which was loaded with firewood. Figured you could use this. Winter's coming on fast. Before Ilara could properly express her gratitude, Mrs. Halloway arrived, her face set in its usual grim lines, but her arms laden with a basket containing freshly baked bread, a jar of preserves, and some mended children's clothes. Can't have those children going hungry or cold, not if I can help it, she stated, marching into the cabin and placing her offerings on the table. More followed. A farmer from a nearby claim brought a sack of potatoes. The quiet woman who sometimes played the organ at the Sunday gatherings brought a thick, warm quilt. It was an outpouring of quiet, practical support that left Ilara speechless and deeply moved. These people, who owed her nothing, who had initially viewed her with suspicion, were now rallying to her side, offering not just material aid, but a sense of solidarity that was more precious than gold. Sheriff Brody returned 2 days later, his expression thoughtful. Well, I ain't found no forgotten deeds or bags of gold Silas might have hid, he admitted. But I did find something interesting. Talked to old Jedediah Miller, who witnessed that mortgage agreement stones waving about. He paused. Miller says Silas was under duress. Stone had threatened to report him to the territorial authorities for endangering minors by having the children in such squalid conditions before you came. Said Silas signed that paper more out of fear for the children being taken away than anything else. Ilara's eyes widened. So, Stone coerced him. Looks like it, Brody said. Problem is, duress is hard to prove after the fact, especially with Silas gone. But it plants a seed of doubt. And Miller, he's willing to testify to what he saw and heard if it comes to that. He looked at Ilara. It ain't a guarantee, but it's something. Stone might not want that kind of information aired publicly, especially with folks already riled up about his actions. The community support, coupled with this new piece of information, didn't magically solve their problems. Stone's legal claim remained. But it changed the landscape. Ilara was no longer alone, facing a powerful adversary with only her own desperate courage. She had allies. The children, witnessing this unexpected kindness from the townsfolk, seemed to stand a little taller. The fear in their eyes was replaced by a dawning understanding that they were part of something larger, a community that, for all its roughness, possessed a core of decency. As the week wore on, the atmosphere at the little cabin shifted from one of impending doom to one of determined resistance. They still didn't know how they would prevail against Jedediah Stone, but they knew they wouldn't face him alone. The kindness of strangers, the quiet solidarity of a frontier community, had given them a fighting chance. Ilara looked at the pile of donated firewood, the quilt on the bed, the extra food in their larder, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. It was the warmth of human connection, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. The day Jedediah Stone was due to return dawned cold and grey, the sky a leaden canvas that mirrored the anxiety in Ilara's heart. She had spent the past days in a whirlwind of activity, fortifying not just their physical surroundings but also her own resolve. Sheriff Brody had advised her to stand her ground, to not simply abandon the homestead, and to let him know the moment Stone appeared. The community support, though immensely heartening, couldn't alter the stark legal document Stone possessed. Yet, something had shifted. The children, sensing the unspoken tension but also the quiet determination emanating from Ilara and the townsfolk who had offered aid, were subdued but not entirely fearful. They had drawn closer, a tight-knit unit, their earlier wariness of each other replaced by a fierce, shared loyalty. Around mid-morning, Stone arrived, not alone this time, but flanked by two grim-faced men Ilara didn't recognize, hired muscle by the look of them. He rode with an air of arrogant assurance, clearly expecting little resistance. Ilara stood on the porch, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the children clustered just inside the doorway behind her, peeking out. Her heart hammered, but her expression was resolute. "Mr. Stone," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the crisp air. "Your week is up." Stone dismounted, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Indeed it is, Miss Crane. I trust you've made arrangements to vacate?" "My men and I are here to ensure a smooth transition of property." Before Ilara could reply, another sound joined the tense silence, the steady rhythm of approaching hooves. Sheriff Brody rode into the yard, not alone either. Behind him were Mr. Abernathy the blacksmith, Mr. Henderson the storekeeper, and several other familiar faces from Redemption Creek, their expressions grim and determined. They didn't carry weapons openly, but their presence was a formidable statement. Stone's smile faltered slightly. "Sheriff, I wasn't expecting a welcoming committee. This is a private matter, not when it involves the welfare of children and the potential perversion of justice." "Stone," Brody replied, his voice level but edged with steel. He dismounted and walked to stand beside Ilara. "Miss Crane is not vacating. And you are not setting foot on this property until a circuit judge has reviewed your claim, especially in light of new information concerning how that mortgage was obtained." Stone's eyes narrowed. "New information? What nonsense is this?" "The document is legally binding perhaps," Brody allowed. "But Jedediah Miller is prepared to testify that Silas Blackwood signed that paper under duress, after you threatened to have these children taken from him." "Coercion, Stone. It's an ugly word. And not one a judge takes kindly to, especially when children are involved." A flicker of unease crossed Stone's face. He hadn't anticipated this. He had expected a lone, frightened woman, easily intimidated. Not a united front. "Miller is an old fool," Stone blustered, though his confidence was visibly shaken. "His word against a signed contract. His word, and the testimony of an entire community that has witnessed Miss Crane's devotion to these children and your predatory tactics," Mr. Henderson interjected, stepping forward. His usual mild demeanor was gone, replaced by a quiet fury. "These children have found a home here, Stone. A chance. We won't see that stolen by your greed." Just then, Martha, her small face pale but resolute, stepped out from behind Ilara. Tom was right beside her, his fists clenched. The other children followed, forming a small, defiant line. "This is our home," Martha said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Ilara, she saved us. Mr. Blackwood wanted us to be safe here. You can't make us leave." Lily, clutching Ilara's skirt, piped up in her small, clear voice, "We belong here. With Ilara." Stone looked from the determined faces of the townsfolk to the fiercely protective stance of the children, and then to Ilara, whose quiet courage seemed to radiate an unshakable strength. He saw not an easy victory, but a protracted, messy, and potentially damaging public battle. His hired men shifted uneasily, clearly not having bargained for this level of organized opposition. The calculus in Stone's cold eyes began to change. The profit he stood to gain from this piece of land, especially against such determined resistance and the threat of a legal challenge that might expose his less savory methods, perhaps no longer outweighed the costs. "This is preposterous," he snarled, trying to regain control. "I have a legal right. And we have a moral one," Ilara said, her voice ringing with conviction. She stepped forward, no longer the uncertain mail-order bride, but a mother lioness protecting her cubs. "These children have endured enough loss, enough fear. They have found sanctuary here. And I will not allow you to destroy that. If you wish to pursue this through the courts, Mr. Stone, then do so. But you will find us, and this community, ready to fight you every step of the way." Her gaze was unwavering, her resolve absolute. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the eaves of the cabin. Stone stared at Ilara, then at the united group behind her. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a sullen, resentful anger. He knew when he was beaten, or at least when the victory would be too costly. With a curse muttered under his breath, he motioned to his men. "This isn't over," he threatened, but his words lacked their earlier conviction. He remounted his horse, his face a mask of fury. "You'll regret this, all of you." Then he and his men turned and rode away, their departure as ignominious as their arrival had been arrogant. A collective sigh of relief went through the assembled group. Ilara felt her knees tremble, the adrenaline that had sustained her suddenly ebbing away. Sheriff Brody clapped her on the shoulder. "You did good, Miss Crane. Real good. I don't think Stone will be bothering you again anytime soon. He doesn't like a fight he can't easily win, especially not a public one." The townsfolk crowded around, offering words of congratulation and support. Mr. Abernathy grinned. "Showed him what Redemption Creek is made of, eh?" Ilara looked at the children, their faces alight with relief and a fierce pride. Tom actually managed a small, grudging smile in her direction. Martha's eyes shone with unshed tears of gratitude. In that moment, standing in the dusty yard of their humble home, surrounded by a community that had become their shield, and with her 7 precious charges safe beside her, Ilara knew they had faced their greatest test and emerged stronger. The unity of their chosen family, bolstered by the unexpected kindness of their neighbors, had triumphed over greed and intimidation. The victory was not just about keeping their home, it was about affirming their right to exist, to belong, to be a family. The defeat of Jedediah Stone marked a profound turning point for Ilara and her 7 adopted children. The shadow that had loomed so menacingly over their existence lifted, leaving behind not just relief, but a strengthened sense of belonging and an unshakable conviction in the power of their unlikely family. Redemption Creek, having witnessed Ilara's steadfast courage and the community's own capacity for collective kindness, embraced them fully. The whispers of irregularity were replaced by murmurs of admiration. Ilara was no longer just the woman who came for Silas Blackwood, she was Ilara Crane, the one who had faced down hardship and injustice to protect her children. And they were, in the eyes of the town, her children. The legalities, though still not formally resolved by a distant circuit judge who rarely visited, seemed to matter less in the face of this lived reality. Sheriff Brody, with a quiet word here and there, ensured that Mr. Grice's officious concerns were kept at bay. Life on the small homestead settled into a new rhythm, one characterized by hard work, shared laughter, and the quiet hum of contentment. The coming winter, once a source of dread, was met with preparedness. The donated firewood kept the cabin warm, the preserved food from the garden and the community's generosity stocked their larder, and the thick quilt ensured cozy nights. Ilara taught the children their letters and numbers, read to them from the few books she possessed, and instilled in them the values of honesty, kindness, and perseverance she herself embodied. Martha blossomed into a capable young woman, Ilara's right hand in managing the household and caring for the younger ones. Tom, his anger finally giving way to a deep-seated loyalty, became a skilled hand at repairs and outdoor chores, his protective instincts now channeled into caring for his siblings and their shared home. Ben and Finn remained a whirlwind of playful energy, their days filled with exploration and invention. Sarah, with her quiet wisdom, became the family's gentle conscience, her artistic talents bringing beauty to their simple surroundings. David, no longer timid, developed a quick wit and a love for storytelling. And Lily, the once silent waif, filled the cabin with her bright chatter and infectious giggles, her small hand often finding its way into Ilara's. Ilara watched them grow, thrive, and heal, and her heart swelled with a love so profound it often brought tears to her eyes. This was not the life she had envisioned when she first read Silas Blackwood's letter. There was no romantic partnership, no easy comforts. Instead, there was relentless toil, constant worry, and the immense responsibility of shaping 7 young lives. Yet, it was a life of unimaginable richness and purpose. She had arrived in Redemption Creek a woman seeking refuge, a companion, a modest future. She had found instead a calling, a family forged in the fires of adversity, and a love more expansive and fulfilling than any she could have dreamed. One crisp spring morning, nearly 2 years after her arrival, Ilara stood on the porch, watching the children. The garden, now well established, was showing the first signs of green. The cabin, once dilapidated, was sturdy and welcoming, smoke curling merrily from its chimney. Tom and Martha were mending a section of the fence, their heads bent together in easy collaboration. The twins were chasing butterflies near the creek, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Sarah was sketching in a notebook, while David regaled Lily with an animated tale. Ilara felt a deep, abiding peace settle over her. She had not just saved these children, they had saved her, giving her a purpose, a place, a love that filled the empty spaces in her own life. Mrs. Halloway, who had become a regular visitor and a gruff but steadfast friend, rode up, a basket of fresh eggs in her hand. "Morning, Ilara," she said, a usual expression softened by a rare smile as she surveyed the scene. "Looks like you've well and truly taken root here," Ilara smiled back, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. "I suppose we all have, Martha." It seems Redemption Creek lived up to its name after all, just not in the way I expected. Later that day, as the sun began to set, painting the vast Montana sky in breathtaking hues of rose and gold, Ilara gathered the children around the supper table. The meal was simple, stew from their garden vegetables, fresh bread, but it felt like a feast. Looking at their faces, bright with health and happiness, Ilara knew she wouldn't trade this life for any other. She had found her home, not in a man's promise, but in the hearts of 7 orphans who had, against all odds, become her family. Her legacy would not be written in grand deeds or accumulated wealth, but in the laughter that now filled this once silent cabin, in the resilience she had nurtured in these young souls, and in the enduring power of a love that had dared to choose, to protect, and to persevere. The mail-order bride had come seeking one thing and found something infinitely greater, a life irrevocably, wonderfully changed. And that's the incredible story of Ilara Crane and the 7 orphans who didn't just find a home, but built one together, filled with love and courage. What a journey! If this story moved you, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of resilience and the human spirit. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What was your favorite part of Ilara's story? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.